Then you also have the Afro-pessimists who are building on the work of who I think is a better sociologist than W.E.B. Du Bois, a theorist by the name of Frantz Fanon. Fanon argues that the discriminatory effects that highlight what blackness is, these biological traits, these biological essentialist traits of blackness, stem from the power elites themselves. They are terms used to discriminate against blacks. And what Afro-pessimists continue to work with Fanon by arguing that there is no such thing as black subjectivity because black socialization within society wiped out any notion of Africanism among black folk, and therefore they became or identified with the practical consciousness of the dominant social institutions. So therefore, blackness became an instrument of different groups to pursue their political agendas. So blackness became tied to transgenderism. Blackness became tied to LGBTQ initiatives. So there's no sui generis black political subjectivity in and of itself. Blackness is an instrument of the power elites to perpetuate whatever political agenda that it may have. And this is the Afro-pessimist. So this notion of looking for a black consciousness or a black community, that's fruitless because there's no such thing. And herein where my critique of both critical theory or critical race theory and Afro-pessimism emerges, because my approach is simply I assume the understanding of conflict theory in that, yes, there is an economic power elite who constitutes society through 5 factors. Those 5 factors are language, communicative discourse, ideology, ideological apparatuses, and the mode of production. And they set up institutions to reproduce their power position within the society. So therefore, in slavery, race was used to perpetuate slavery. Class was used to perpetuate industrial production, etc. down the line. And from my perspective, the Afro-pessimists are correct. Contemporarily, within post-industrial Western societies, blackness is used to perpetuate the LGBTQ agenda on plurality and identity politics. So therefore, blackness have always been a political tool for the power elites. So that's the conflict approach, and this is how they reproduce capitalist society. Now, is there a racial identity that blacks recursively organize and reproduce? This is where I disagree with Du Bois and argue no, there is no black identity because blacks have, since slavery, blacks have sought to assimilate within the dominant social structure. Now, there was a strife between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington over this issue, because the question becomes, what is the racial politics of groups of blacks within different societal organizations? Well, W.E.B. Du Bois wanted liberalism and assimilation, and Booker T. Washington, his emphasis was on segregation, economic segregation, as well as social segregation. And those two different perspectives has dominated black politics since the encounter of blacks within, or Africans within the dominant Western paradigm. Because from Booker T. Washington to W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, those paradigms have dominated black politics since slavery. So for me, the problem with critical race theory, and this is where I believe that Fanon is a better sociologist, because critical race theory seeks to integrate blacks into Western society by convicting the society of not identifying with its values, which are deemed universal. The values of Western society are deemed universal values for all human groups. So therefore, when blacks internalize these values and recursively reorganize and reproduce these values in their actions, by Western society discriminating against blacks when they recursively reorganize these practices, it shows the hypocrisy of Western society. And what critical race theory is trying to say, we must convict white Western society for not living up to its values because of its discriminatory effects. So therefore, the conviction of white society for not living up to its values to allow blacks to integrate the society because of its discriminatory effects, the emphasis becomes on assimilation and integrating a society that is already problematic. It's problematic because of its relations of production, constituting society on the relations of production. And this is where Fanon was so brilliant in The Wretched of the Earth, because what Fanon is arguing is not, no, we should not seek to integrate or assimilate into Western society by convicting them for not living up to their values. Instead, the emphasis should be black people need to organize and constitute a new humanism, a new society based on alternative values that diametrically oppose Western society, which introduced slavery in order to constitute their capitalist society. So the articles that I had you read, I know they were very difficult, were basically my critique of, let's say, 300 years, 200 years of understanding racial identity, racial formation, racial politics, and resistance. And what's happened since Du Bois, since Fanon, is that many of these theorists, Gilroy, uh, um, Cornel West, Patricia Hills Collins, the late Bell Hooks, they're basically reproducing the same ideas from uh, 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 of either Fanon or Du Bois. Du Bois, at the end of his life, he realized that blacks would never be allowed to assimilate. He became very pessimistic, would never be allowed to assimilate into Western society. Whereas Fanon, at the end of his life, felt that blacks should not seek to assimilate into Western society. And that's the political, that's the racial politics. And contemporarily, what you have between critical race theory and Afro pessimism are those who believe there's no black subjectivity. So forget about this notion of identifying as black and trying to constitute a new political order based on quote unquote blackness, which is a repeat of black essentialism, versus those, those who are seeking to convict Western society of not living up to its values or identifying their values when blacks recursively organize them to integrate the society. So this is the pushback that whites against critical race theory are arguing, well, if we live in a post-racial world, we've had the first black president, there should not be any need for critical race theory because it becomes obsolete in a post-racial, post-structural, post-gender society. And I will end on this so I can take some questions. I know you all have had a long day. The question that I'm dealing with contemporarily, I don't deal with the issue of racial identity because in the West, I believe blacks have assumed the identity of their former colonial slave masters. So they reproduce Western values in their everyday practices. So for me, racial identity is a moot point, especially if you understand race as a social construction as opposed to a biological factor which Du Bois held on to understand double consciousness. So for me, racial identity is a moot point. And I say it's a moot point because what we're witnessing contemporarily as blacks integrate Western society, that they are in turn reproducing white supremacy. By that, I mean, if Barack Obama had a different orientation, a different racial orientation from, let's say, his Western predecessors, his white predecessors who preceded in his presidency, Bush, Clinton, etc., he would not have invaded and destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa. If he had an African worldview, a black worldview, he would not have destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa. If Lloyd Austin, the contemporary defense minister in America, if he had an alternative world view, racial identity from his white colleagues, he would not be supporting a fascistic Nazi society such as Ukraine. The Afro pessimists are correct to point out there is no black racial identity in the West, because as blacks are integrated into white Western society, they are basically reproducing the same practices that led to their enslavement, imperialism, ethnocentrism, American exceptionalism. So now you have blacks themselves who are supporting things which we diametrically were against coming out of the civil rights movement, coming out of slavery, things such as colonialism. Now we have blacks who are practicing neo-colonialism, Obama, Lloyd Austin, Kamala Harris. They're reproducing white supremacy on a global scale. So for me, we need to rid ourselves of this racial thinking and start to emphasize what Fanon, looking at the values and the ideas that we recursively reproduce in our actions, as opposed to this emphasis on racial identity, which I believe we need to move away from. And I'll end on that and take questions.
Thank you, Paul. And you always, a minute. You always start off with I start off with a radical note first. And as we go through the weeks, they will hear all different people and what they have to say. So thank you very much. That's really helpful. I'm putting it to the class. Do you want to have a break now, or do you want to go straight on to questions? Questions? Okay. I'm going to start with the inside people first, on the inside in the class. If you have a question, do let me know. Do anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Yes, come on down. They're going to come down to you, Paul. It's easier.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
But I'm so glad we were able to kind of pursue this and get online. Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for your lecture.
Yeah, come around. You don't need that thing. Just stand there.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very eye-opening, and I really liked on the ways that you touched on the different theories, Afro-pessimism, critical race theory. But I was wondering, and you mentioned bell hooks like slightly, but what are your thoughts on like how Black feminism deals with identity? And I'm thinking of theorists such as like Audre Lorde and not bell hooks, Angela Davis.
Yes, good question. The same issues that I raised about race are also the same issues I raised about gender. I have a new book coming out, which I call Third Wave Feminism and Feminist Patriarchy, because the same issues, the same sociological premises that go in defining race and racial identity are also factors in defining gender identity. And this notion of intersectionality, which is plaguing in identity politics, which is plaguing contemporary theories now, in which the emphasis is on lived experience and how serial identities go into constituting who we are. Now, the problem that I have is as though it implies as though my gender, my race, my age, my sex, my local, my sexual orientation, all have different practical consciousnesses that determine my existence. They don't, especially if you look at it from a social constructivist perspective. That's gender, for example. What I argue about gender in this new book, which is a co-authored book, is the fact that coming out of the 1960s, there was this notion of the feminization of Western society, the Gaia movement, etc. And this understanding was that there were certain feminist qualities or that women ought to institutionalize, and basically we need to feminize Western society. Now, let's look at this from an empirical perspective. As Western society, with the integration of women in power positions, has it been feminized? If you're an honest theorist, of course it has not been. You take people like Hillary Clinton, Victoria Nuland, these are more warmongering psychopaths. They're insane. They're no different from their behavior, and their worldview is no different from the men in the same power positions that they hold. So for me, when women or when groups want to highlight, oh, there's a feminist practical consciousness. Well, those are your radical feminists who want to argue that we need to constitute society on feminist grounds, though that's not a form of biological essentialism. That's absurd. So for me, when you look at theories like intersectionality, feminist theory, they're pseudoscience. It's just absurd because those theories cannot account, if there's any intellectual honesty, it cannot account for how, if gender is a social construction, if gender is grounded, if women practices are grounded in a feminist essentialism, they cannot account for how do we produce someone like a Victoria Nuland? How do we produce Hillary Clinton, who are warmongering lunatics? Let's be honest about it. These are people who threaten the world. They threaten world peace, and whether or not they're in a pants, skirt, it doesn't matter. So for me, the same factors that go into understanding racial identity are the same factors that go into understanding gender and gender identity. These are social constructivist serial identities that are a result of structural differentiation, and they do not bring an alternative worldview upon which we need to constitute what Fanon calls a new humanism. You cannot constitute a new humanism based on gender identity. That's absurd. So that's how I look at feminism, gender, sexual orientation. In fact, from my perspective, these serial identities are a result of post-industrial capitalist identity politics, and have no value whatsoever from in a theoretical sense. But that's my perspective.
I was going to say that's your very, very ruthless perspective.
Yes.
And I'm sure that quite a lot of students are going to disagree with what you have to say, because that's where we've got a big policy in the university, which is called disagreeing well. Okay, so we want to explore all different ways of thinking. So this is your perspective, and that's really helpful to hear your perspective. Now, is there any other questions? Yes, come down. There's another person coming down to you, and then I'm going to go online. Don't forget to say who you are. Just stand here. Okay.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. I'm Julius. I'm from Uganda.
Yes.
Yeah, listening to you is quite interesting. But what kept running in my mind is the kind of education, the curriculum that we all inherit and we have continued to be educated in even right now, as we are in London, we are still in the same curriculum, which still presents the West as that category. So do you think at one point we'll be having a situation where would stop, our curriculum will be totally independent, that it will maybe the idea of the white supremacy will be, for lack of better word, neutralized? Thank you.
Yes, great. Another great question. And I'll try to get out of the theoretical realm to focus to use more empirical evidence to justify my position. There is a turn contemporarily on what we call a multipolar world, whatever. But there's this move which began with Russia. The Chinese during the Mao Cultural Revolution also began this movement away from a Western-centered education. Um, the Haitian Revolution also, because whenever we think about the Haitian Revolution, the understanding is that, again, it goes back to how I define racial resistance. The understanding was that blacks were enslaved by the French in Haiti, and they wanted liberation, and they wanted to constitute their own society. And that position is usually defined between Toussaint Louverture, who was trying to integrate into the world capitalist system of the time of the 18th century and 19th century, and Dessalines, who wanted nothing to do with the capitalist world system at the time. But what is missing is the African perspective, what we call Haitian sociologist by the name of Jean Casimir. He called it the counter-plantation system. I call it the voodoo ethic and the spirit of communism. Because what happened in Haiti, there's a struggle between the mulatto elites who represented the intent to reproduce the capitalist world system and maintain slavery on the island, the black elites the Creole blacks who wanted to maintain slavery and allow blacks to own slaves, and then the Africans who wanted nothing to do with Western society and constitute their own humanism on the island, which what we call libertarian communism on the island. Well, contemporarily, there's also this push away from a Western-centered education model, because now in the West, we're decentering as a result of postmodernism and post-structuralism. We're decentering the subject, and all that matters is narratives and my personal truth. So there's this move away from objective truth. And if you listen to the last speech that Vladimir Putin gave, this is one of the things that the Russians are doing as well, moving away from this postmodern, post-structural turn that the West have initiated since the 1980s, and away from what we call a more analytical approach to understanding reality. So the emphasis in the West becomes narratives, lived experiences. So this is why your politicians, they lie to you about everything. They're liars. What matters are narratives, narrative framing, my lived experience, my truth, as opposed to dealing with objective reality and understanding objective reality and how objective reality shapes our consciousness. So I believe, to answer the brother's question, there's a need, and this is why Fanon is so important when we're looking at racial theories and and issues about the constitution of society, because there is a need for a new humanism, especially in the West. The model that we're trying to implement in the world is destructive. It's leading to pollution. It's leading to exploitation around the world. It's leading to climate change. And there is a need for an alternative model to resolve these issues that the West does not offer. So if we, as Black people, stay within the same systemicity that is leading to the destruction of the material resource framework, eventually we ourselves will be destroyed. This is what MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., in a speech before he was assassinated, he said, I feel as though I am integrating my people into a burning house. Because he realized when he made this class turn to understanding the capitalist relations of production allow blacks to go from slavery to a resource, a lumping proletariat for industrial production, he realized that if black people recursively reorganize and reproduce this system, it will lead to our own destruction. So there is a need for us to come up with an alternative humanism to fend off the destructive forces of capitalist relations of production under American hegemony.
That was an excellent way of perhaps not answering the question, but to build around the question about curriculum. Thank you, Paul. Is anybody online? I'm dependent on Temi here to see if anybody's online wants to ask a question.
I think Zara's got her hand up.
Okay, Zara, yes.
Yeah, so alluding to your article on against CRT and to the point you've just actually made, you did say that you made reference to Islamic fundamentalism as a kind of a system that kind of looks beyond the West. And with Islamic fundamentalism as such a big umbrella, were there any groups, like for me, I thought more in terms of like Hezbollah, the Iranian Revolution, who are very strong on like Western toxification being very dangerous against kind of imperialism and this worldview that that is not, defined by the West. But then with that same kind of umbrella, you have Taliban, ISIS, and all of these other groups. So which groups did you have in mind? Because again, with Islam being such a big religion, there are different political doctrines and all sorts.
I'm not big on the Wahhabism of Saudi Arabia or anything of that sort. But to your point, yes, the emphasis on the Iranian Revolution and this notion on marginalizing the toxicity that comes out of Western society. For me, that is my understanding of Islamic fundamentalism. Same thing, because it's a parallel between the Iranian Revolution that takes place as well as the Haitian Revolution, because there's this intent to rid the constitution of society based on the exploitative and toxic notions that we find in the West. So this emphasis on nationalism, traditionalism, for me, although in the West, the interpretation of, let's say, the Iranian revolution was identifying as a fascistic movement, which is what they do to the Chinese movement. This is the same thing they're doing to any movement, and by they, I mean the West, the power elites in the West. Anything that deals with traditionalism and nationalism for them is fascistic, which obfuscate the fact that their own society is constituted on fascistic principle. And it's a theoretical point, because all societies are mechanical solidarities. This notion that the West is an organic solidarity that comes out of the middle third time is absurd. All societies have been mechanical solidarity. They establish institutions to reproduce values and practices that they want social actors to recursively organize and reproduce in their lives. So yes, for me, I'll celebrate a movement such as Islamic such as the Iranian Revolution at the expense of Wahhabism, for example, Hezbollah, even Hamas, because Hamas is one of the few resistance movements against the Zionist colony Israel. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Zara. Next question. Temi, you're able to ask a question if you.
Anybody else has any questions? I can't see anybody with their hand up, so it might be the only one that we've got on.
We've got somebody here. Come on down.
Hi. My name is Talima. My question is, you mentioned Barack Obama and I guess like his success in politics, and perhaps you mentioned things about him letting go of certain parts of his racial identity to find success in the political atmosphere. I was just thinking, and I'm interested in your opinion, because even within British politics, when we have people of colour, whether it's MPs or even our Prime Minister, they seem to let go of their racial identity, or they want to appear, they often don't even mention their race when talking about policies, or they ignore their own communities. So I was just interested in your opinion. Do you think in order to find success, even within politics, you have to let go of your own race in order to find success?
Great question. I hate using, and this is the problem that I have with racial identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, because all of these serial identities, because on the one hand, sociology emphasizes social constructivism. Let me give you a clear example. If blacks, within the sociology of race, if blacks were to have, and I'm using E. Franklin Frazier, the Black Bourgeoisie, as well as Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and my own work for you to understand this. In order to have, for blacks, women, sexual orientation, whatever, to have had their own racial, for black people, racial identity, they would have had to constitute their own societies on 5 institutions: their language, their communicative discourse, their own ideology, their own ideological apparatuses, and their own mode of production, which diametrically oppose that of society from whence they came. This is the argument that Malcolm X is saying. Blacks have to segregate, build their own in order to interact. This is the idea of Marcus Messiah Garvey. This is the idea, this is the notion of black segregation, of Booker T. Washington, constituting their own societies and recursively interpolating and reproducing social actors to constitute that society. But the minute you get into this push for integration, you're integrating the linguistic, the communicative discourse, and ideology of the dominant power structure. Blacks in America sought to integrate Western American centric society. And how did they do that? They fought for equality in education. They fought for equality, medical care, etc. And in doing so, they had to recursively reproduce the values and principles of the society. Hence, you get a Candace, you get a Barack Obama. Barack Obama, what makes Barack Obama black? His skin, but does his skin color gives him a different worldview from the presidents who preceded him? No, Barack Obama was no different from Bill Clinton, George Bush. He was a fascist. He was a racist. Lloyd Austin, Richie Sunak. What made Barack Obama, in order to get into the political sphere, basically was socialized and raised by his white mother and white grandparents, went through the Ivy League institutions of America, the highest institutions in the world, and then represented the values of the power elites once he integrated the political sphere. The same is true of Richie Sunak. Sunak is no different from any of his white predecessors. He reproduced the values and ideas of his white predecessors. This is why he can support a fascistic British colonial system that is working with the American colonial system to subjugate other groups such as Russia, China, etc. He is supporting a Nazi regime such as Ukraine. He is supporting a fascistic apartheid colonial state such as the Zionist colony Israel. This is absurd. And because we see different skin tone or different gender on these people, we automatically assume, oh, they bring in an alternative political a voice. They do not. Hillary Clinton does not bring in an alternative worldview from that of the men who preceded her in her position. She cheered the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. And if she had a quote unquote feminist worldview, you don't go on national TV. We came, we saw, he died. That's absurd. We have to get out of this framework of associating, and then this goes back to this notion of biological essentialism, of associating worldviews with either skin tone, gender, or just because someone is transgender, that means they're less they're less barbaric in the Western male predecessors. That's absurd thinking, and this is what it means to be an intellectual. To get out of this notion of looking at biology, sex to determine the worldview, and this is what the sociological perspective brings to the table.
Thank you.
Was that helpful?
Yes, controversial but helpful.
Very controversial. Yeah, I'm holding on to my job here. So, I mean, you know,
There's no predicate to truth. Truth has its own. I know we live in a postmodern world in which we all believe we have our own truth. There's no such thing. You have a perspective. Now we can get into the Kantian debate whether or not we can know noumena, the thing in itself, or does the human brain allows us to access truth. I differ from Kant. I'm not a Kantian.
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's lots of things I disagree, but I think it's important we're in a university. And I think
Absolutely. Because look what they're doing here, and I know they're doing it in the UK too. What's happening at the universities? I implore my students to go out and protest because you cannot sit by and watch what's going on and assume the dominant narrative. No, absolutely not. You must stand up for truth.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
then what's sad, I want to take more questions, but before I want to get to this point. For me, I do believe, and this might be my Haitian heritage, because in Haiti we were. If you look at what's happening in Haiti contemporarily, Haiti is the only country in the West, in the Western Hemisphere, that America has not been able to subjugate. They've been trying since independence, and why? Because
Paul, yeah,
yes.
could you, I mean, it might be helpful, just very quickly, just to enlighten people about Haiti. Because people may
Oh, okay,
not know
okay.
about Haiti. I mean, I know about Haiti, but people may not know about
Oh,
Haiti.
I'm sorry. I'm making an assumption. I apologize for that.
Yeah.
Haiti was what we call the first Black Republic. Now, it's the only successful slave rebellion in recorded history. And the Haitian Revolution commences on August 14, 1791, and goes to uh, um, January 1st, 1804, when the first emperor of Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, declares Haiti an independent imperial nation. It was supposed to be open to all blacks who were enslaved throughout the world. And we fought three superpowers to gain our independence. Haiti was not granted independence. It fought for 13 years. And we fought the French, the British, and the Spanish, eventually defeating Napoleon in 1804 when Dessalines declares independence. Haiti has been occupied. Haiti was blockaded after independence. And there was a struggle within Haiti. And this is where race and racial identity, you can see the social constructivist nature of race and racial identity. Because in America, they had a one drop rule. What that meant is if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black in America. Then Haiti, if you had one drop of black blood, of white blood, you're considered white. Hence the distinction between mulattoes, Creole blacks, those were blacks who were born on the island, and the Africans who were exported. Now, when Haiti gains its independence in 1804, 70% of the population were directly from Africa. This is why our way of life in Haiti parallels village life in Africa. So what happens is there's this fight between the mulattoes and the Creole blacks, whether or not Haiti should be a mercantilist, slave country or a liberal country that allows free trade. And the Africans wanted, so basically this fight is between, should we reproduce Western European model to constitute Haiti? The mercantilist model of the of Britain, England, Britain, France, etc., or a more liberal free trade model, which came about with Adam Smith in 1776. The Africans wanted nothing to do with that model, and what they did was, when Dessalines was assassinated by the mulattoes, many of the Africans went into the provinces and in the mountains, and they reproduced a more libertarian communal system, which we call the Lakou system in Haiti. America has tried to occupy Haiti from 1915 and 1934. They fomented coups in Haiti, but they are unable to oppress Haitian society because of the fact that Haiti instituted an alternative model to constitute society from that of the West. And in order to fight the destructive nature of Western society, this is what we needed to do. And we haven't done so. It's unfortunate. And so therefore, now the emphasis become on narrative, my truth, etc., as opposed to the truth. And we're seeing young people now protest and fight, especially in America, against the neoliberal order that is justifying genocide. This is insane. These people will get on TV and lie to us, but because they believe their values are universal, we accept it. We refuse to confront or speak truth to power. And it's absurd. This is absurd. We have to, and this is where, I'm passionate about teaching truth. And I implore my students to protest, to stand up against genocide that's being perpetuated by a Zionist colony, Israel. It's insane.
Thank you very much. Any other final questions there may be at all?
I think Lucy had a question. I know
Hi, Lucy.
Go ahead. I do apologize for that.
Lucy's the musician in the room. So, hi, Lucy. And then I think after that we may stop, actually. Come on, Lucy.
Yeah, so it was just kind of going back to the previous thing that you were talking about. Because I wasn't sure, like with for example, the warmongering psychopaths, the female ones. Is it that like they are reproducing a like male behavior type that is coming from society that they've learned and seen that is in opposition to their sort of inherent female nature? Or is it that that's not a thing and human beings, regardless of gender, who are of the personality type to seek and gain and hold power in the current society, do that behavior type and it's not actually male specifically? Does that my question?
I don't subscribe to the notion of female nature. That would be like saying there's a black nature, a heterosexual. No. I believe this is my sociological background. They're socialized to be psychopaths. If we assume what Theodore Adorno calls the authoritarian personality, we're dealing with people, fascistic people with authoritarian personalities who are going around promoting the agenda of the power elites to monopolize the world's resources, exploit labor, and destroy, even though, and this is a contradiction, the very practices they put in place is a threat to the material resource framework in our own nature, in our own human nature. It's a threat to all species on Earth, but yet they overlook that for what Carl Polanyi called the fictitious commodity of paper money. It's absurd. It's completely absurd.
So I think that's kind of my question. Because they're women, does that mean they have to be socialized to be psychopaths? They can't just actually be psychopaths? Like, is it not possible just
I
because
see
you
that.
come from a historically oppressed group? Does that mean you cannot also be a psychopath by nature?
Yeah, and that's my point. Yes, so we
Okay.
agree on that. Yes, you would think if there was such a thing as a female nature that it would be less prone to psychopathic behavior. Just the same, if Black people took into account their historical experience in slavery and in the systemicity of white supremacy, it would be less prone to go out and exploit and kill other people of color for global capital. But that's not what Obama, Kamala Harris, Susan Rice, Condoleezza Rice, all of these lunatics, they're lunatics. To be honest, they're all lunatics. We have to, and this is the purpose of the university, to distinguish between lunacy and truth. And some of these people are lunatics and psychopaths and fascists and Nazis. I know I got off on a tangent. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we have to be careful of the language we use as well, because that in itself creates trauma for people. So we have to be very mindful of the language. So I'm not here to police the language. I know you have to be careful of the language. But I appreciate what you're saying. And Lucy, I appreciate what you've just said regarding women, because I was thinking about the same thing. You know, you've got women in your student group or in your workplace or in your family, and you think, how did that happen? How do they think in that particular way? But of course, it's something which you look into. One final question anybody's got, because I'm also, look, it's 2015. The time's decided. Any last question?
Yeah. Can I ask one last question? Yes. I wanted to get your views on like radical imagination and kind of building this new humanism. So what are your views on how we can build that imagination to see beyond these structures and kind of get out of how embedded it is into our collective psyche and try to avoid being agents of these very things that we are trying to work against?
That's a loaded question. I spent my half of my academic career working on that particular question. I start with the issue of consciousness because for me, there's a need to reevaluate the nature, the ontological nature and origins of consciousness because of this need for a new humanism. In physics, there's this notion we cannot define a new world from the same consciousness that created the world we're trying to change. So I developed my theory of phenomenological structuralism and consciousness field theory to understand how can we, because in sociological parlance, the debate is between structure and agency. Do we have agency, or are we all super determinists determined by social structure? And this is a theoretical issue that I've been grappling with since I was 27. I'm 48 now. But for me, to answer your question directly, there's a need to remove ourselves, detach ourselves from the language of the power elites, remove ourselves from the institutions of the power elites, reconceptualize reality in relation to the ontological origins and nature of consciousness. What happens to our consciousness? We have to reconceptualize these questions that the West gave answer to in the form of existentialism, Nietzschean pessimism. We have to move away from that and reconceptualize notions of consciousness. How am I to live with my neighbor? How am I to live with animals, with other species? There's a need to reconceptualize that if we are to salvage humanity in the world. But if the intent is to reproduce the current structure remember, we're allowed at your university, you're allowed this space right now. And never forget that the university itself, as Louis Althusser points out, is an ideological apparatus. It is in place to reproduce the very system we're trying to fight against. So never forget that. And we're reminded of that when we see what's happening on college campuses contemporarily, where the administrative staff are calling other apparatuses, such as the police force, to attack students on the university grounds because they're protesting against Zionist colony Israel and its genocidal practices. So we never forget that the institutions you're matriculating in are in place to reproduce the very system that we're fighting. And there's a need to detach ourselves and reconceptualize our relations to the earth, our relations to other species, and our relations to each other. So that's how I'll answer that.
Thank you. And when we think, I mean, I wasn't old enough then, but when we think about South Africa and what happened with apartheid, presumably, I mean, there's no one in this room that old neither, but presumably there'd be the same struggles and discussions that took place with apartheid within South Africa. And I'm not particularly saying any other country, but I'm just saying there was, and students were the ones who went out and were in their masses within South Africa. And look what happened.
And not only South Africa, Victoria, but also remember, we're now celebrating 40 years of Kent State because the same practices was happening to students now happened 40, 50 years ago in America when
1968,
police killed, bombed. We're dealing with the political elites who constitute society and trying to reproduce their interests. So,
a lot there.
freedom is not free.
No, but there's a lot there. Thank you so much. I appreciate your controversial debate, and I hope that students recognise that this is a class where there's going to be views. So next week will be slightly different. Thank you for your time. I'm glad we eventually got you on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. There was a task we were going to do, but we'll do it next week. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, students. Do stay behind. Thank you, Paul, and I hope to see you again soon. Good luck with
No
your work.
problem.
Please, can I just ask, as Paul disappears, Timmy, can you take the recording off, please?